All right, thank you very much. I'm Jack Jamieson, presenting a paper on behalf of my colleagues Naomi, Yamashita, and Boase, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. On the brief outline of the paper, I'll talk about our background and research questions, our participants and methods. Then I'll go over our findings, some discussion and design implications. And finally, I'll discuss some limitations of the study. So our background is that, of course, there's an increasing number of international students all across the world, and especially in the context where we did this study in Japan. And these students encounter a lot of challenges and obstacles, such as a culture of stress, which is the physiological or psychological and physical discomfort experienced when adapting to a new cultural environment can seem to be overly demanding. They can also experience loneliness, which can be multiple different types of loneliness, and of course language difficulty, both related to their studies and to their daily life, their social life in their new environment. So our motivation is we want to know how can we as design scholars improve support for students in this situation. And we address this with three research questions. First, we wanted to look at what types of problems foreign students identify experiencing. Second, to what extent are these problems already adequately supported? And can we find any reasons why some problems are supported and other problems don't have any support? And then third, once we've identified those problems that are most lacking in support, how can we work to address those with language or social technologies? So in the title of our paper, we say that our participants constitute a unique population, so I'll explain why. So our participants were 15 graduate students at 2 universities in Japan. They were mostly male, which was an unfortunate skew, but we did have a very wide range of countries from around Asia, as well as students from Europe and one student from Paraguay. Now, most of the research in this area, at least that which was published in English and so is accessible to us, is focused on students who are non-English speaking students studying in predominantly English-speaking countries. And in this case, they have a language mix really of two languages. So of course they use English for their studies and for most day-to-day interactions in their new environment, and then their home language mainly for interacting with co-nationals, other students, or communities from the same country as them, or communicating with people back home. But in contrast, we had a much more complicated language mix because our participants tended to have a very strong English skill, and in fact much stronger than their Japanese peers, and conducted most but not all of their studies using English. They had to do a lot of interactions in Japanese, both in daily life and sometimes at school, and here they had quite weak skill. And of course they could use their native language for the same thing, socializing with people back home. But what this meant is that we could view similar kinds of problems with different levels of language barriers. So we could see a situation conducted in English where a language barrier was not so much of an issue. We could see the same situation having to be conducted in Japanese. And this allowed us to start to identify cases where the language barrier was the main problem, or cases where underneath the language barrier was some other problem that was actually more significant. So we conducted our study first by loaning our participants an Android phone that had an application we designed installed called the Study Abroad Scrapbook. And we asked participants to complete daily surveys for 5 weeks, where we asked them to indicate their communication logs, who they'd communicated with each day, discuss their emotions and experiences through multiple choice questions, and then we invited them to write brief kind of free text diary entries. So here are some screenshots from the application. So first, when participants would indicate who they communicated with each day, they could create a list of all their contacts, and they could see the names of these contacts, but we didn't need to record that, so we didn't collect that on the server. But instead, we collected some information about their demographics, the type of relationship with each person. And each day, participants could say, I communicated with the following people, and they could indicate whether a communication was weak or strong. So for example, this communication with Mike was weak, which might mean I sent a quick email to Mike and that's it, or I saw him in the hallway. Whereas this communication with Taro was strong, so that might mean you sat down and had a longer conversation, a more substantial communication. Then to identify the types of problems that our participants were having, we got them to complete a survey. We asked them, do you feel homesick? Did you experience moments of culture shock today? Did you have language problems? And they could rate these from 1 to 5, from not at all to strongly. Following the application data collection, we had an interview with each participant, which was about an hour long, semi-structured. And these served to add a lot of depth to the data we collected through the app, and also in some cases we could clarify some points of confusion where the app data, we weren't quite sure how to interpret it, so we could sit down with the participants and ask them what was going on exactly. And most previous studies in this area have used mainly cross-sectional surveys, looking at students in one point in time. So the benefit of us having this 5 weeks of data collection followed by an interview was that we could start to differentiate between temporary or persistent problems over that period, and we could also identify if and when problems were addressed. So if a participant indicated they had some problem on Monday and then on Friday they solved the problem, we could track that kind of change. So for our findings, the first finding that we had as we were exploring the data was that we could categorize the problems experienced by our participants along 2 dimensions. And these dimensions ended up being quite important for understanding why there were different levels of support for different types of problems. So we did this using qualitative open coding of the diary entries from the app as well as our interview data. We identified 141 problems in total and coded each along these dimensions. So the first was functional versus non-functional problems. Functional problems were those where it was a problem that was related to some essential task and had a direct impact that prevented that from being achieved. And these would be things like completing one's studies, since students came to a new country for the purpose of doing their studies, so this was essential. And also things like finding food, finding accommodations to live in, so really essential things that if they didn't solve this problem right away, there would be a big problem. Non-functional tasks, or non-functional problems were those that were related to activities that may not be immediately essential, but could still cause a lot of stress if they weren't addressed. And in large part, these were social or emotional kinds of problems, though not exclusively. And the second dimension is language-related problems or not language-related problems. And of course, sometimes the line was a little blurry in between these. But we categorized language-related problems as cases where language was the clear and direct cause of the problem, such that if you could remove that language barrier somehow, the problem would no longer exist. And non-language problems meant that language was not the primary cause. So language could still be, make things a little worse or a little more difficult, but removing the language barrier, you'd still have a problem existing. And then we looked at how each of these different types of problems were supported. So on this chart we have, it's divided into 4 columns. On the left half we have language-related problems, and here functional and non-functional. And then on the right half we have non-language-related problems, functional and non-functional. And we coded 3 levels of support. Adequate support meant basically the problem existed, it was recognized, but then it was solved. Inadequate support meant that participants indicated they found someone or something that attempted to help solve the problem but didn't quite solve it, so it was still a problem after that. And no support meant that participants just indicated that they didn't have any help for this problem at all. And you can see that problems that were functional and language related had much higher levels of support, over 50% adequate support, and in it, almost all problems had at least some attempted support. And as we proceed to the right of the chart, we end up with a much lower level of support, to the point that were non-functional problems that weren't language related, really barely any of them were adequately supported. So to understand why different types of problems were well supported or not. I'll go through a couple of examples from each. So with functional problems that were language related, most of these kinds of problems were pretty universal. These often related to things like communicating with professors. It's a central task, it's language related, and of course all students have to do that. Or things like arranging accommodations and purchasing food and having to navigate language difficulties while doing that. And of the types of problems that were well supported, these were the ones that were most common. A lot of students had them, they were well recognized, so students' institutions tended to be aware of these problems. And it was the problems that were less universal that were most lacking in support. And the clearest example for us, in our study, 6 of our participants were Muslim. So that when they were looking for food, they needed to find halal food, which is quite difficult in Japan. Not because it didn't exist, but because the food labels didn't contain any information about halal or haram. One student said, well, I go shopping and I want to ask, is it halal? But they don't understand English, so it was very difficult. And some students described having a very limited set of food that they could eat for the first part of their trip while they were learning what food they were able to eat or not. And these sorts of problems were not well supported by the host country, but people experiencing these problems tended to turn to co-nationals, people from the same country. So one student said, well, we have a Muslim community that has a post on Facebook with foods on halal. So they were able to get help, but they had to go outside of their institutions and find a local community experiencing the same types of problems. So for non-functional problems, so the less essential things that were language related, again, many of these were pretty universal, pretty commonly experienced. Most of the time when problems arise, it was because our participants had to make some kind of communication, either using Japanese or were trying to socialize with their Japanese peers who had a very low level of English ability. So with regard to socializing, one participant said, well, they try to speak English to me sometimes, but most of the conversation's in Japanese. So it's nice her peers are trying, but they just didn't have the ability. And the student said, well, sometimes I feel like I'm alone because I have nothing to say. And one of the proposed solutions was that social media or email can be a better option for communicating with Japanese, since they're good at writing English, but they're not very good at speaking in English. And you could even have some kind of fun sort of things like using emoji or stickers. Now this helps for text-based communication, but doesn't get very far for spoken communication. So with functional problems that were not language related, these tended to be a little less supported. These often were things like having difficulty with Japanese academic styles or expectations. So a few participants indicated they would be in their lab and they wouldn't really know what the norms are, how they're supposed to behave, what the expectations are for assignments, and this wasn't communicated very well all the time because, of course, their Japanese classmates already knew this, since this was a normal part of the Japanese academic system. And this was another case where our participants didn't really get much support from their hosts, from other Japanese people, but they did get support from fellow students. So one person said, well, in the beginning, I thought it was only me who was having this kind of apprehension and difficulty understanding the expectations. And then said, but when we foreign students had a conversation, I learned we had the same experiences. I thought it was only me. So there was just this lack of awareness that was a bit of a problem. And of course, the least supported problems were those that were not functional and not language related. One of the clearest examples came from this participant who described himself. He said, well, Latin American people were so open. So for example, in the morning, you ride to the office. If it were Latin America, you'll go say hello to everyone, But in Japan, it's kind of difficult because they always ignore you. He says, I come here and I sit at my place, and the guy next to me won't even look at me, so really for me, that's still different. And this was a huge cultural difference. And by the way, as I was doing this study and I was working in a Japanese office, I can definitely say that seems to be absolutely accurate. So based on identifying these types of problems and trying to identify in what cases was support the least, we could see that generally the functional problems were a little bit more visible because they had a bit more urgency, so they were better supported for that reason. When it came to language problems, the least supported, tended to involve informal communication. Formal communications you could put in writing, you could find workarounds. Informal is much more difficult. When it came to non-language problems, they tended to be related to cultural differences and particularly to a deficit of awareness from host country people. And when it came to those kinds of problems, participants tended to turn to co-nationals. So briefly, because I think I'm running out of time, but I'll just talk about our design implications. We thought there's a lot of potential for work that would be supporting face-to-face intercultural communication. A lot of existing work tends to focus on textual communication or computer-mediated communication, and also tends to focus on comprehension, but actually our participants tended to be more interested in trying to generate speech. Was a big issue for them. There's some work in this area, like machine translation, that's very promising, but of course still a little bit immature, especially when it comes to spoken word. But there's definitely an opportunity to expand in this area. One of the things that would be necessary is trying to change the way that we evaluate technologies for informal communication. A lot of the work about language support tends to involve experiments conducted in labs and measures such as looking at how quickly people can collaborate to complete a task. And these are great for understanding formal kinds of communications, but doesn't always translate to informal communications, where the goal is not to complete a task, but rather to establish like social cohesion or inclusion. And lastly, our participants had a lot of difficulty communicating problems, particularly when they felt that they were the only one experiencing that. So we feel that and they were able to turn to co-nationals for support in many cases, but this meant that their institutions, one, didn't know how to support those problems, and sometimes didn't even really know that those problems existed because they were left out of the loop. So universities that are trying to cater to a lot of international students may do well to try and create systems or programs with which those students can offer more feedback or be able to express what kinds of difficulties they're having. And this would help those institutions understand those, so in future years be able to predict what kinds of problems will come up. And finally, of course, there are some limitations to this project. Because it was self-report, especially with the communications data that we had, it's very difficult for people to accurately remember who they communicated with every day. So we have to accept that that data is somewhat incomplete or inaccurate. It's also very difficult to self-report emotional issues. So that is a definite limitation of this project. And again, we only had 5 weeks of data collection. So this was nice, but of course acculturation occurs over the course of years as students are undergoing their studies. So future work, as well as pursuing the design implications we talked about, may benefit from using different measures for the communication or emotional issues, and also for perhaps following students over multiple years, or even considering the success of students in completing their goals after graduation. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
It might be in the paper, but how long have they been in the country?
Oh yes, that is in the paper. It was slightly variable, but for most of the students, they had been in the country for less than 6 months. Okay. We tried to get as close to the start of the semester as possible. It ended up, ideally I would have arrived in Japan to do the study kind of at the start of the semester, and just logistically, we were a few weeks in. But for the most part, they were been in Japan for less than 6 months.
And I know that you say that you had a small sample size, but one thing I wondered was you talked about how important the co-national community was. And so if you were to clump them, like you talked about the 6 Muslim students or the 3 women, or did you find that there were, again, I know that you have a small n, but can you speak to how that helped? So if there was a bigger community of Germans, then maybe they had less problems, or did you not see that at all?
Well, it seemed to be most important for the Muslim students we had, and I think partly because they had particular difficulties that they really needed support with. In fact, one of the things that we found is we asked students to indicate every day how many people did you communicate with and how comfortable did you feel. For the Muslim students, when they communicated with more co-national people, on those days they reported that they felt much more comfortable. And that was not the case for any of the other students. And in fact, it was a little bit the opposite, which was surprising. So I think those communities were very important. The most obvious was the case of the Muslim students. It is difficult with a small sample, and particularly with our other students. We could say, oh, we had like, I don't know, 3 Chinese students, 2 Thai students. It's not really enough to get a sense of. Thank you.
All right, let's thank our speaker again. Actually, you know what? We're running out of time. Could we